The hem wouldn't lie flat, and Clara Vance was beginning to suspect the silk Mrs. Hartwell had purchased was cut against the grain. She squinted at the stubborn fabric in the failing afternoon light, her fingers pricked raw from 3 hours of invisible stitching. The cramped room above her shop smelled of lamp oil and the cabbage someone was boiling 2 floors down. Somewhere in the street below, a cartwheel had broken, and the driver's cursing competed with a street preacher's warnings about the coming judgment. "At this rate, I'll finish this commission in time for Mrs. Hartwell's funeral instead of her daughter's wedding," Clara muttered, setting down her needle to massage the ache building behind her eyes. She'd made it halfway to the window for better light when the shouting started. Clara paused, her hand still holding the uncooperative silk. The East Ward was always loud, peddlers hawking day-old bread, factory bells marking shift changes, the occasional brawl outside the gin house. But this was different, sharper, the sound of men unified by purpose rather than scattered by chaos. "Saw him turn down Ashford Street. He won't get far, not in that coat." Clara moved to the window, pulling aside the thin curtain that did little to keep out the draft. Her breath caught. Below, a knot of men, 5, maybe 6, moved with the coordinated menace of a hunting pack. Workers, by the look of them, soot under their nails, anger in their shoulders, the kind of men who'd learned that the world respected nothing but force. They were closing in on something, someone. She spotted him a heartbeat later. A man in a fine gray coat pressed himself against the sooted brick wall of the shuttered tailor's shop, his hands raised in a gesture Clara had seen too many times, the universal language of someone trying to reason with the unreasonable. Even from this distance, she could see he didn't belong here. The cut of his clothes, the way he held himself despite the fear, like a thoroughbred in a dogfight. "Revolutionary sympathizer, are you?" The largest man stepped forward, jabbing his finger at the stranger's chest. "Fancy men from uptown coming down here to make promises you won't keep." "I assure you there's been some mistake," the cornered man's voice carried up to her window, cultured and careful. Clara's fingers tightened on the curtain. She should close it, pull back. This was the East Ward, where debts got settled in blood, and strangers learned quickly to mind their own business. Her landlord, Mr. Kettering, had warned her a dozen times, "Your soft heart's gonna get you killed, girl. The world doesn't reward heroism, just asks for more." But she'd also seen what happened when everyone looked away, when good people decided someone else's crisis wasn't worth the cost. The decision made itself before she fully thought it through. Clara grabbed her blue velvet cloak, the one luxury she owned, a remnant from better days, and threw it over her shoulders. Her hands trembled as she fastened the clasp. Stupid, this is stupid! But her feet were already carrying her toward the door, down the narrow stairs, into the cold mist of the street. The air hit her like a slap, coal smoke and river damp, and something sharper. Fear, maybe, or the metallic promise of violence. The mob hadn't seen her yet, too focused on their quarry. The man in the gray coat had his back flush against the wall now, nowhere left to retreat. Up close, Clara could see the fine weave of his clothing, the way his dark hair fell across his forehead, the tension in his jaw that suggested he was calculating odds that didn't favor him. She needed something, some intervention that would shatter their certainty, make them question whether they had the right man. Her mind raced, skipping over and discarding a dozen impossible plans. Then she saw it, the way the leader had positioned himself, blocking the stranger from the main street. They wanted this private, which meant they weren't certain. The worst idea she'd ever had crystallized in an instant. Clara closed the distance in 6 strides, her boots loud against the wet cobblestones. "There you are!" 7 heads turned. The stranger's eyes met hers. Gray, she noticed, not brown. Startled and utterly bewildered. Up close, he was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 30, with the kind of aristocratic features that belonged in a portrait, not pressed against a soot-stained wall.
She grabbed his lapels, quality wool, expensive, and pulled.
The kiss was meant to be brief, a scandal, just enough to make the mob pause, to make them wonder if they'd cornered a local man with a sweetheart rather than whatever revolutionary they'd been hunting. But the moment her lips met his, the East Ward fell silent. The stranger went rigid with shock. Then, impossibly, his hand came up to cup the back of her head, steadying her, as if he'd been expecting this all along, as if they'd done this 100 times before. Clara's eyes squeezed shut. The blue velvet hood fell back from her hair. Somewhere distant, she heard a pitchfork clatter against cobblestones. And in that suspended moment, with the taste of mint and expensive tobacco on her tongue, Clara Vance had no idea she was kissing the Earl of Crown. The brass bell above Clara's shop door chimed 3 days later, and she looked up from her embroidery hoop to find the stranger filling her doorway. He'd cleaned up considerably since the kiss. Gone was the soot-stained gray coat, replaced by simple but well-made clothing that still managed to look expensive in ways Clara couldn't quite name. Dark wool trousers, a waistcoat that fit too perfectly to be off the rack, a white shirt with cuffs that hadn't seen a day's hard labor. His hair was combed back, revealing the full aristocratic lines of his face, sharp cheekbones, a mouth that looked unused to smiling, and those gray eyes that had haunted her sleep for 3 nights running. "Miss Vance," he said, and his voice was exactly as she remembered, cultured, careful, the kind of accent that came from expensive tutors, not East Ward streets. Clara set down her needle with deliberate slowness, buying herself time to steady her breathing. "I don't recall giving you my name." "You didn't." A ghost of amusement touched his features. "But you're not difficult to find. The seamstress with the blue velvet cloak who kisses strangers to save their lives, you've become something of a legend in the space of 72 hours. Heat climbed her neck. "If you've come to mock me, I've come to thank you." He stepped fully into the shop, and Clara noticed he moved with unusual grace, like someone accustomed to being watched. "And to apologize. That situation put you at considerable risk you had no obligation to assume on my behalf." Clara stood, smoothing her skirts, to give her hands something to do besides tremble. "You're welcome, and apology accepted. Was there anything else?" "Actually, yes." He produced a calling card from his pocket, extending it between 2 fingers. "Ian Thorne. I'm a clerk for Hastings and Webb, the shipping merchants. I'm in need of a tailor, and given that you quite literally saved my life, it seemed only appropriate to bring you my business." She took the card, studying the simple engraving. Nothing ostentatious, but the quality of the cardstock alone probably cost more than her weekly rent. "A clerk who can afford bespoke tailoring?" "A clerk who's been saving for months and would very much like to not look like one when he petitions for a promotion." That almost smile again, self-deprecating and entirely too charming. "Besides, I believe I owe you a debt, one I'd prefer to repay in honest work rather than empty gratitude." Clara ran her thumb over the raised lettering of his card, every instinct screaming that Ian Thorne was not remotely what he claimed to be. But she needed the work, and he needed clothes, and perhaps she could convince herself that's all this was. "Measurements, then," she heard herself say. "And, Mr. Thorne, next time you wander into the East Ward, try not to look quite so much like easy prey." His smile, when it finally came, was devastating. "I'll endeavor to remember that, Miss Vance." Chapter 2. Stolen Moments. Ian Thorne became a fixture in Clara's shop with alarming speed. He came first for the waistcoat fitting, then returned 2 days later claiming the buttons weren't quite right. Then it was a shirt that needed taking in at the shoulders, followed by a request for an entirely new jacket because the color doesn't suit after all.
Each visit stretched longer than the last, measurements giving way to conversation, conversation bleeding into the kind of easy companionship Clara hadn't realized she'd been starving for. "You're going to bankrupt yourself at this rate," Clara said, her mouth full of pins as she marked the hem of his trousers. "No clerk's salary can sustain this much tailoring." He was perched on her work stool, looking entirely comfortable in her cramped shop, with Tommy the cat purring in his lap. "Perhaps I'm investing in my future. First impressions matter in business." "First impressions happened 4 fittings ago." Clara glanced up, catching the flicker of amusement in his eyes. "What are you really doing here, Mr. Thorne?" "Ian," he corrected, as he had every time, "and I'm enjoying the company of someone who says precisely what she thinks. It's refreshing." "Refreshing," Clara repeated, sitting back on her heels. "That's a diplomatic way of saying I have no manners." "That's an honest way of saying you're the first person in months who's treated me like a human being, rather than a—" He stopped abruptly, something shifting in his expression, "rather than a means to an end." Clara filed that slip away for later examination. She'd noticed he did that sometimes, started sentences he didn't finish, deflected personal questions with the skill of someone who'd had considerable practice. For a shipping clerk, Ian Thorne had remarkably aristocratic secrets. But when he asked about her work, he listened like her answers mattered. When she ranted about Mrs. Hartwell's impossible demands or the landlord's latest rent increase, he didn't offer empty platitudes. Instead, he asked questions that suggested he actually understood what it meant to survive on the margins, even if Clara suspected he'd never lived there himself. "Tell me something true," she said suddenly, abandoning the hem to look at him directly. "Just one thing. I've spent 2 weeks clothing you, and I don't know anything real about you." Ian was quiet for a long moment, his hand stilling on Tommy's fur. When he spoke, his voice was softer than he'd ever heard it. "I'm tired of being alone, and you make me feel less so." The confession hung between them, raw and unexpected. Clara's heart did something complicated in her chest. "That's the first honest thing you've said since you walked through my door." "It's mine," he whispered. "I know. I'm sorry." His eyes held hers. Chapter 3. The Shadow of the Earl. The guards came for Thomas at dawn. Clara was measuring ribbon when Mrs. Yates from downstairs burst through her door, still in her nightcap, her face gray with panic. "They've taken him, the Earl's men, said he was involved in planning sedition." The spool of ribbon clattered to the floor, unspooling like a blood trail across the floorboards. "That's impossible. Thomas wouldn't. He's careful. He's always careful." "Careful doesn't matter to them," Mrs. Yates gripped Clara's shoulders. "They're saying there was going to be a riot at the docks, that your brother was helping organize it." Clara's mind raced. Thomas had been angry lately, yes, attending more meetings, coming home with pamphlets stuffed in his coat, but he was smart enough to stay clear of actual violence. He had to be. "Where did they take him?" "The Earl's holding cells beneath Crown Hall." Mrs. Yates dropped her voice to a whisper. "Clara, you know what that means. Men who go there don't come back the same, if they come back at all." The name landed like a stone in dark water. Crown, the Earl of Crown, whose guards patrolled the East Ward like an occupying army, whose policies had shuttered half the district's factories, whose cold indifference to their suffering had become legend, a man who signed eviction notices over breakfast and raised rents with the seasons. Clara had never seen him. Nobody in the East Ward had, really. He was an absence rather than a presence, a shadow that fell across their lives without ever showing its face. But she'd heard the stories, the ruthlessness, the absolute conviction that people like her and Thomas were problems to be managed rather than human beings to be heard. "I have to see him," Clara said, already reaching for her cloak. "I have to make him understand Thomas isn't dangerous. You can't just walk up to Crown Hall and demand an audience with an Earl." Mrs. Yates looked at her like she'd gone mad. "They'll throw you out, or worse." "Then I'll beg." The word tasted like ash, but Clara forced it out anyway. "Thomas is all I have." She thought of Ian then, suddenly and painfully. Would he help if she asked? But no, a shipping clerk had no influence with nobility, and she couldn't bear to show him this kind of desperation, to watch his carefully cultivated interest curdle into pity. This was her burden, her brother, her fault for not seeing how close to the edge he'd been walking. Clara fastened her blue velvet cloak with shaking fingers, already composing the speech she'd give to the cruel Earl of Crown. She'd make him see reason. She had to. She had no idea she had already kissed him.
Ian's note arrived the same afternoon Clara returned from her failed attempt to see the Earl. She'd made it as far as the gates of Crown Hall before the guards turned her away without even the courtesy of delivering her message. "The Earl doesn't take petitions from commoners," one had said, as if she were begging for alms rather than her brother's freedom. The humiliation still burned 3 hours later. Now she stared at Ian's elegant handwriting, the paper quality alone announcing its origins from somewhere beyond the East Ward. "I require the jacket delivered to Crown Hall this evening. Would you be willing to bring it personally? There's a matter I'd like to discuss. I.T." Clara's hands trembled. Crown Hall. Of course Ian would have business there. Shipping clerks probably dealt with the Earl's household accounts. It felt like fate offering her a second chance, however slim. She arrived at sunset, her best dress beneath the blue velvet cloak, the finished jacket wrapped in brown paper under her arm. A different guard admitted her this time, directing her through servants' passages that smelled of beeswax and old money. Even the back corridors were grander than anywhere she'd ever lived. Ian met her in a side parlor, and Clara's breath caught. He looked different here, like he'd shed some invisible disguise, more comfortable, dangerous almost, in how naturally he inhabited this space of silk wallpaper and crystal chandeliers. "You came," he said, and something in his voice suggested he doubted she would. "You said you had something to discuss." Clara forced herself to look at him rather than gape at the room. "And I need to ask a favor. My brother, he's being held here, in the Earl's cells. I need help getting a message to him, or to whoever might show mercy." Ian's expression shuddered. "Your brother is Thomas Vance. You know about it?" Hope flared, desperate and painful. "Clara." He stepped closer, and she noticed he'd dropped the Ms. Vance entirely. "I can't discuss the Earl's prisoners, but I can tell you that sometimes arrests are meant as protection rather than punishment, to keep people away from situations that would end badly for everyone involved." "Protection?" The word came out sharp. "He's in a cell. He's alive and safe, which he wouldn't be if he'd gone to the docks tonight like he planned." Ian's gray eyes held hers with uncomfortable intensity. "Trust me on this, even if you can't trust anything else." Clara wanted to argue, to rage against the injustice, but something in Ian's face stopped her. He looked pained, like the words cost him. "Why do you care?" she whispered. He reached out, fingertips barely grazing her cheek. "Because you do, and somehow that's become enough." Around them, Crown Hall gleamed with wealth she'd despise forever. But in this moment, with Ian looking at her like she was something precious, Clara felt her certainty beginning to crack. Chapter 5. The First Real Kiss. Ian led her to the gardens after she'd composed herself, claiming the fresh air would do her good. Clara suspected he simply couldn't bear to watch her cry in that perfect parlor, surrounded by the Earl's obscene wealth, while her brother languished in the cells below.
The gardens were impossibly beautiful, hedge mazes and marble fountains, roses that bloomed impossibly late into the season, tended by hands that had nothing better to do than coax beauty from the earth. Clara hated it on principle, even as something in her chest ached at the moonlit perfection of it all. "Does it ever bother you?" she asked, trailing her fingers along a stone balustrade. "Working for people like this, seeing how they live while the East Ward starves?" Ian was quiet for a long moment, his profile sharp against the silver light. "Every single day." The honesty surprised her. "Then why stay?" "Because leaving wouldn't change anything, and staying means I can do small things, protect people when I can, make choices that matter, even if no one sees them." He turned to face her fully, "Like keeping your brother safe, even if you hate me for the method." "I don't hate you." The words came out softer than Clara intended. "I don't understand you, Ian Thorne. You talk like a gentleman, but work like a servant. You commission enough tailoring to feed my shop for months, but claim to be saving for a promotion. You look at me like—" She stopped, heat climbing her neck. "Like what?" He stepped closer, and Clara could smell the soap he used, something expensive and cedar-scented that had no business making her heart race. "Like I matter," she whispered. "Like I'm not just some East Ward seamstress you saved on a whim." "You saved me," he corrected, and there was something raw in his voice now. "That day in the street, you had every reason to walk past, to let them have me, and instead you—" His hand came up to cup her face, thumb brushing her cheekbone. "I've been trying to understand it ever since. Why you did it. What kind of person risks everything for a stranger?" Clara's breath caught. "The stupid kind, apparently. The extraordinary kind." Ian's other hand found her waist, pulling her closer. "Clara, I need you to know something. Whatever happens, whatever you learn about me, that day meant—" He seemed to struggle with the words. "You meant something. You mean something." "Ian." He kissed her. Not the desperate collision of their first kiss, performed for an audience with violence breathing down their necks. This was intentional, gentle. His mouth moved against her lips like he was memorizing the shape of her, like he had all the time in the world and wanted to spend it exactly here. Clara's hands fisted in his shirt, pulling him closer, and she felt him smile against her lips. When they finally broke apart, she was breathing hard, her forehead pressed against his. "I'm in love with you," she said, and meant it with terrifying certainty. "God help me, I'm in love with a shipping clerk who's definitely lying about something." His laugh was pained. "Clara, don't." She pressed a finger to his lips. "Don't tonight. Let me have this one perfect thing before reality ruins it." Chapter 6. The Unmasking. Michael Davies had been Thomas's closest friend since childhood, which is the only reason Clara let him into her shop, despite the wild look in his eyes. "Where is he?" Michael demanded, not bothering with pleasantries. "Thomas hasn't been home for 3 days. His landlady says the Earl's men took him." "He's safe," Clara quickly said, setting aside the shirt she'd been hemming. "I have it on good authority he's being held for his own protection. There was going to be trouble at the docks." "Good authority," Michael's laugh was bitter. "From who? Your new gentleman caller? The one who's been haunting your shop for weeks?" Heat climbed Clara's neck. "That's none of your concern." "It is when—" Michael stopped abruptly, his gaze fixed on something behind her, his face drained of color. "You!" Clara turned. Ian stood in her doorway, a package under his arm, more commissions he didn't need, more excuses to see her. He had frozen at the threshold, every line of his body gone tense. "You're Sebastian Ashford?" Michael's voice shook with barely contained rage. "The Earl of Crown?" The name landed like a physical blow. Clara's vision narrowed to pinpoints. "What?" "Don't listen to him." Ian, no, Sebastian, stepped forward, hands raised. "The Earl of Crown," Michael repeated louder. "The Earl who's been bleeding our district dry, who arrested Thomas, who's probably been using you this whole time to spy on us." "No," the word came out strangled. Clara looked at the man she loved, searching for his face for denial. "Tell him he's wrong. Ian, tell him he's wrong." "My name is Sebastian," his voice was quiet. "Sebastian Ashford, Earl of Crown. And I'm sorry." The shop tilted. Clara grabbed the edge of her work table, her fingers going numb. "You lied to me." I couldn't." He took another step forward, and she recoiled like he had struck her. Something shattered in his expression. "Clara, please, let me explain." "Explain what?" Her voice cracked. "That you've been playing dress-up in my shop? That you let me kiss you? Let me fall in love with you while you were the same man who arrested my brother? Who makes the policies that starve us?" "I arrested Thomas to save his life." Sebastian's composure fractured. "There was going to be a massacre at the docks. The magistrate wanted to make examples. I put him in my cells so he'd be protected, not punished." "You don't get to be the hero in this." Clara cut him off, tears burning her eyes. "You don't get to imprison people and call it mercy. You're the reason we needed protection in the first place." "Miss Vance, get out." She pointed to the door with a shaking hand. "Get out of my shop, out of my life. Go back to your manor and your title and leave me alone." "Clara, please. That's not my name to you. Not anymore." She turned her back on him, staring at the wall until she heard his footsteps retreat, the bell chiming his exit. Only then did she let herself break. Chapter 7. The Siege. The mob came for Crown Hall 3 days after the unmasking, and Clara learned about it from the same source as everyone else, the runners shouting through the East Ward at dawn. "They're marching on the Earl, every able man to Crown Hall." Clara's blood turned to ice. She threw on her cloak and ran. The crowd had already gathered by the time she reached
the estate, hundreds of workers, armed with whatever they could carry. Pitchforks, hammers, the righteous fury of people who'd been pushed too far for too long. She spotted Michael at the front, Thomas beside him, freshly released and burning with the zeal of the newly freed. "Thomas!" Clara shoved through the crowd, grabbing her brother's arm. "What are you doing?" "What we should have done months ago." His eyes were feverish. "The Earl can't hide behind his walls anymore. He can't arrest us all." "He'll kill you!" Clara's voice broke. "Thomas, please, this isn't the way." "He used you, Clara, used you to spy on us, to learn our plans." Thomas's face was hard. "And you defended him. You're either with us or you're with them." The words cut deeper than any blade. Before Clara could respond, a voice rang out from the manor steps. "Stop!" Sebastian stood alone on the grand staircase, no guards flanking him, no weapons visible. He looked smaller somehow, stripped of the pretense she'd watched him wear, just a man facing down an army. "I won't give the order to fire," he called out, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent crowd. "You have grievances, real ones, and you deserve to be heard." "Heard?" Michael shouted back. "We've been heard for years while you did nothing." "You're right." Sebastian descended another step. "I failed you. I inherited a system that grinds people down and told myself that managing it was enough, that small mercies mattered more than real change." His eyes found Clara in the crowd, held for a heartbeat. "Someone recently taught me that was cowardice." "Pretty words won't feed our children," someone yelled. "No, but action will." Sebastian pulled something from his coat. Papers, Clara realized. Official documents with seals. "I'm opening the granaries, suspending rents for 3 months, and I'm petitioning Parliament to investigate working conditions in every factory under my authority." He held up the papers. "It's already signed, legal, binding." A murmur rippled through the crowd, confused, uncertain. "Why should we believe him?" Thomas demanded. "Because I'm not asking you to. I'm doing it regardless. You can burn my house down if it makes you feel better, but it won't change that these reforms are already in motion." The mob wavered. Clara saw the moment the fury began to crack, replaced by something more dangerous, hope. "This isn't over," Michael said, but his pitchfork had lowered. "No," Sebastian agreed, "it's just beginning." The crowd was dispersing, but the danger hadn't passed. Clara could see it in the faces around her, men who wanted to believe, but had been disappointed too many times, men who'd come for blood and wouldn't leave satisfied with promises. "He's lying," someone murmured near her. "Earls don't change. This is a trick." "Aye," another voice agreed, louder. "He'll wait until we're gone, then send his guards after us one by one." The murmur grew, anger rekindling. Clara watched Sebastian standing alone on those steps, refusing to retreat even as the mob's mood shifted again. He'd dismissed his guards, signed away his advantages, made himself completely vulnerable because he believed it was right, because she taught him it was right. "He's telling the truth." Clara's voice came out stronger than she felt. Heads turned. "I know him. You knew Ian Thorne, a lie he told to seduce you." "No, I knew Sebastian Ashford. I just didn't know his name." She climbed the first step, then another, until she stood halfway between the mob and the Earl. "You want to know why you should believe him? Because 3 weeks ago, I kissed a stranger to save his life, and I'd do it again right now, knowing exactly who he is." The East Ward went silent. Clara turned, climbed the remaining steps, and stood directly in front of Sebastian. Up close, she could see the fear in his eyes, not for himself, but for her, the desperate hope that she wasn't about to destroy herself for him. "I love you," she said quietly, just for him. "I hate your title, I hate what you represent, but I love who you are when you stop hiding behind it." "Clara," his voice was urgent, afraid for her rather than himself. She ignored him, turning to face the crowd fully. "If you want to hurt him, you'll have to go through me, through every person who believes people can change, can choose to be better than their circumstances demand." Thomas was staring at her like he'd never seen his sister before. Michael's pitchfork hung loose in his hands. "Give him a chance," Clara pleaded. "If he fails, you can always come back." Spring came to the East Ward differently that year. The granaries opened first, just as Sebastian had promised, then the rent suspensions, then something unprecedented, the Earl of Crown himself, in shirt sleeves, working alongside carpenters to rebuild the collapsed tenement on Ashford Street. No guards, no ceremony, just a man with a hammer who apparently decided titles mattered less than keeping his word. Clara watched from her shop window as he transformed from distant aristocrat to permanent fixture. He was terrible at carpentry, she noted with private amusement, but he kept showing up day after day until even the most skeptical workers began to offer him tips instead of threats. Thomas came by one evening, leaning against her doorframe with the closest thing to an apology she'd likely get from her stubborn brother. "He's actually doing it. The factory inspections started last week, 2 foremen already sacked for unsafe conditions." "I know," Clara said quietly. "Michael still doesn't trust him, says it's all performance." "And you?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "I think you saw something in him the rest of us were too angry to see, and I think he's trying to become worthy of it." He straightened. "Doesn't mean I have to like him, but I won't stand in your way anymore." It was as close to a blessing as she'd receive. Sebastian came to her shop that night after the workers had gone home, still dusty from the day's labor. He looked exhausted and more real than she'd ever seen him. "I've been thinking," he said without preamble, "about debt." Clara set down her needle. "Have you?" "You've saved my life twice now, once from a mob that wanted to kill a stranger, once from becoming the kind of man who hides behind walls while people suffer." He crossed the room, kneeling beside her chair, with none of the aristocratic grace she'd once found so suspicious, just a man facing down an army. "I can't repay that debt, Clara, but I'd like to spend the rest of my life trying to." Her breath caught.
"Marry me," Sebastian said. "Not because I'm an earl who can elevate you, not because you're a seamstress I'm rescuing from poverty, but because you're the bravest person I've ever met, and I want to spend every day becoming someone worthy of the faith you had in a stranger." She touched his face, her fingers tracing the new calluses on his jaw from weeks of honest labor. "You already are." "Is that a yes?" She pulled him up, kissed him thoroughly, and felt him smile against her mouth. "That's a yes," she whispered, "on one condition. Anything. No more lies, ever, not even kind ones." "I promise." He kissed her again, softer. "Though I should warn you, I'm still terrible at carpentry." Clara laughed, and it sounded like coming home.